We just got a ton of new information and details around the Outer Worlds. Pretty recently, we talked about how we just learned that the Outer Worlds is going to be an Epic Games Store and Microsoft Store exclusive for about 1 year. We also did get a presentation at PAX East where we got a ton of gameplay. I actually broke that down if you are interested. But following that panel at PAX East, we also got several different interviews from media outlets that attended PAX East. Most of these interviews were conducted with the co-directors of this game, that being Tim Kaine and Leonard Boyarsky. These are the guys to originally create Fallout way back in the day, and they also worked on Fallout New Vegas. So in this video, I'm going to go over some of the major or otherwise interesting details around those. And we do learn quite a bit of interesting things. Even further, I would expect further interviews to be released over the next couple of days. If you guys do enjoy the content, I do encourage you to leave a like or subscribe. It doesn't seem as of yet that we got a confirmation of a big presentation at this year's E3 for the Outer Worlds, but it seems pretty likely, and I will be there trying to bring you some coverage of whatever we see. One of the first major things touched on is the role that the theme of the Outer Worlds has. In effect, it's going to be a very corporately driven game. The corporations are the ones that founded these colonies and thus have a heavy influence in them. In effect, it's going to be one of those games that in reality is a dystopia, but a lot of the people there are trying to ignore that. They're trying to pretend everything's okay. During this gameplay preview we just saw at PAX, we actually get a look at Byzantium. This is meant to be one of the most prestigious cities that are really hard to gain entrance to. During our playthrough of the game, we're going to hear a lot about this city, rumors about what it is or isn't from outsiders, but when you actually end up making your way to it, you're going to see how a lot of that may not hold to be true. And one of the pretty interesting things they discuss around this is between choice and actually short-circuiting the game as they describe it. First and foremost, we've heard many times how the Outer Worlds is going to have a ton of choice. Apparently, pretty early on in this game, you're going to have the option to work with the board. This is going to allow you to get access to Byzantium pretty early on in this game. But this is notable because it's going to create a major divergence in the gameplay. If you do this in one playthrough, it's going to be distinctively different than another playthrough. Later on in the game, things will connect down the same path, but there will be major choices like this that makes it a very replayable game. That's something the developers really want to see. Although they want you to replay this game in the sense that once you finish the main story, at least as it stands right now, that's it. There's not going to be an open world for you to explore. The way they phrased this, it seemed like it was very much so open to change. When in the present build of the game, once you complete that last quest, you are done. You're going to have to create a new playthrough to play more of the Outer Worlds. And even further, even though this isn't an open world game, you still will have the option to go to areas that you really weren't necessarily supposed to, or that the game doesn't guide you into. You can skip a large chunk of the game just by walking in a certain direction, or going somewhere that you just know where it is because of past playthroughs. This will be difficult because you'll encounter a lot of higher level regions you're not supposed to get into, but it still is possible, similar to the Good Springs to New Vegas run you could do in Fallout New Vegas. And they actually describe how some of these early decisions or overarching choices you make can really shape a playthrough. If you really cozy up to the board, you'll see better vendor prices all throughout the game. That might make it so you spend a lot more time trading with these vendors. Alternatively, let's say you go on a kill everything playthrough or take down a few core NPCs. This will have gameplay consequences and change the experience that you see throughout the rest of your playthrough. But even further, building off of this corporate ideology, this is going to be a game that doesn't feature crafting. From the gameplay we've seen and some of the other details we have heard, we do know that there's going to be brands and logos all throughout this game. The corporations are a major component. For that reason, the developers felt like it wouldn't make a ton of sense if you were always crafting your own things along the way. Rather, there's going to be much more of a focus on acquiring existing items that do have some of those brands and corporate identities intertwined in them. In the past, we've heard about how different items will have different stats based on the manufacturer, like Spacer's Choice weapons being one of the cheapest, but also the least durable. So no crafting as you're probably used to it in some of the Fallout games, although there still will be weapon modification. That seems like it's going to be another stat that varies between brands, certain brands having much more customizable items. Something unique about weapons in this game outside of being able to customize them yourself, apparently there's certain weapons you could find in the world that are augmented in a way that you wouldn't be able to do and you can't do. To me, these sound a lot like unique weapons, like take maybe the regular pistol and you could find one that has a special ability that you can't get unless you find this individual iteration. But all of these are going to be very heavily brand focused. focus, like it's from this particular brand. One of the other really big things they focus on during some of these interviews is the constrained nature of this game. It's not a large game, and we know that. This isn't a game with a AAA budget, it's not going to be a game that is super long, but they talk about some of the benefits that actually brings. During the development of the Outer Worlds, from a very early point, they wanted to make the game playable from start to finish. So it has, in fact, been playable from start to finish for a while now. This enabled them to do a couple of things. First and foremost, now you can actually squash a lot of bugs. As people are actively playing the game and they see a bug pop up, they can remove that. And they really emphasize this. The constrained nature of this, not trying to have a ton of different systems or floating features, will make it so on release, this game will mostly be a bug-free experience. They discuss past games that they have released that weren't as bug-free and how they really learned from that, and they're trying to avoid that with the Outer Worlds. And they really are emphasizing this, so I feel like if this ends up having a catastrophic release, it will kind of shoot themselves in the foot. You'll probably see a lot of these quotes pop up again, but hopefully it isn't, and it's going to be a game that actually is bug-free, which surprisingly in 2019 and even 2018 isn't all that common. But even further, building off that idea of this being a game that you can play from start to finish, even very early on in development, it allowed them to do a lot more tweaking. As people were playing the game, they realized, hey, I haven't gotten into combat in a while. Maybe we should have a few more enemies in this area, or make other systematic changes just as you go from region to region or progressing through the story. One of the things we didn't get in this game as a byproduct of this more limited budget that seems to get a lot of coverage is the lack of a romance option. You can't romance your companions here, and they actually talk quite a bit about that. They mention how they didn't want to just have that shoehorned into this. They wanted to have it narratively make sense if they were going to do it. And they decided they didn't have the time and resources to do it well, so they weren't going to do it at all. They focused more on just creating well-rounded characters. They also mention along with these companions that at one point there was some kind of morale system in this, where if you made the wrong choices, you could be seen differently, but they opted away from that, rather just having the companion's personality dictate how they'll react to your choices. In past interviews, they've made it quite clear you'll probably know what the companions want or don't want, and what you do in the game will affect that. We saw during the recent gameplay how companions can interject into your conversations, but even further, we learn here that let's say you make some pretty major decisions or interact with other factions during the main story. Sometimes when you return to your ship, your companion will actually call you aside and be like, hey, I heard what you did and I have a problem with that. Even further, apparently as your companions are sitting on your ship, they'll interact, and even while you're not there, sometimes your computer will give you updates as to what's going on with that. There's something interesting as far as interacting with companions go. All the companions are going to have goals, as I kind of referenced to, but by talking to them and potentially through good speech skills, you're going to be able to persuade them away from some of their existing goals. Make it so their desires change and potentially reflect differently based on what you do. And the developers are quite clear about this. This isn't always a good thing. Sometimes you will lead these companions down a darker or objectively worse path as a result of your interaction. Also, for those of you concerned about whether or not this game will be a single player experience or have multiplayer elements, they made it very clear in some of these interviews, this is a solely single-player game. There are no multiplayer elements, and even further, they actually really wanted to emphasize you as a hero. In multiplayer games, you lose that, but in the Outer Worlds, you are going to be one of the main driving forces. Even further, comparing this to other single-player RPGs, they wanted to implement the flaw system. The flaw system basically gives you some kind of debuff, like let's say this enemy is consistently attacking you and doing well. Now you can take a flaw where they deal bonus damage to you, but in return you get to take one extra perk, which is very valuable. I believe there's only 15 perks you can take total, so adding a couple on top of that could be a pretty big deal. They say really their goal with this system was, in a lot of RPGs today, you start out as being not so good, and towards the end of the game, you're kind of just a god. This is adding more depth to that. You are going to still have things you are weak towards and that are particularly strong against you through these flaws. But of course, this is all optional. You can ignore the flaws if you want to. We also hear some interesting components of the Supernova difficulty. We've heard about this in the past. We know in this difficulty mode, it's going to be a lot more hardcore. Some of the examples we've heard are that companions can actually die permanently on this mode from enemies attacking them. Even beyond that, it gives you the opportunity to actually take on more flaws. But in one of the most recent Q&As, we actually learned that the Supernova difficulty is going to add in survival features. You'll be required to eat, drink, and sleep, and if you don't attend to those, your character will actually get debuffs over time. Some of these can have pretty major consequences, although they don't really describe what. But based off the system, it sounds like it'll probably be pretty similar to the ones we see in Fallout or Fallout New Vegas. They also talk a bit more about the encumbrance of this game. There is technically no weight limit on your character, but if you go over your carry weight, you will no longer be able to sprint or fast travel, so literally exactly how it works in Fallout. During one of the recent Q&As, somebody actually asked, what kind of effects will side quests have on the main story? They mentioned how these are largely going to be separate, but there's going to be certain times where if you did complete a certain side quest, it will be referenced or mentioned, but it doesn't seem like there's going to be major additional story options in the main quest because you completed something during a side quest. This is pretty interesting because it's the total opposite of what we recently heard from Cyberpunk 2077, which is known for being a much larger budget game. And there's some other things that show from this being a smaller budget game, like even though we are getting a dynamic weather cycle as well as day and nights, other NPCs in the world won't actually move. They'll always be in their static locations because they didn't want to program all the various conditions of them traveling to their homes. And other cut features like a third-person option because of all the additional steps involved in that. They'd have to ensure there's no bugs from going to third-person in certain interiors, or even the additional animations that would be required. One thing that's actually pretty interesting is there were some questions popping up about Earth and the real world, or modern times as it is today, and how that relates to the Outer Worlds. Obviously, it is a futuristic game, there is a diverting point somewhere, and they actually mentioned how one Reddit theory was really correct. It predicted pretty accurately what exactly happened, or really one of their plans for what could have happened, or the explanation of the Outer Worlds history, and that is President McKinley wasn't assassinated, meaning we never got some of the trust busting and then several of the other dominoes that didn't fall as a result. This is particularly interesting because in reference to this, they discuss how this is something they would really explore more in future games, and there's not a ton about what's going on Earth or even the history of this universe in the Outer Worlds specifically, but it genuinely seems like these guys have big plans for whatever they could do next. And assuming this game is a success, I would love to see the Outer Worlds 2 on a AAA budget, which now that they have been acquired by Microsoft, I think that is fairly plausible. Again, assuming the first one is a success. Although as they talked about sequels, they did mention that if they were to do one, it likely would be a different experience, not a continuation of your character's choices. They talked very broadly about this, that maybe if they had a really good idea, it could take place 5 minutes after the ending of the Outer Worlds, but it's more likely that it will just be similar to the Fallout games, where it's a different story in the same universe. And just as a few extra miscellaneous things I do want to point out for the end of this one of the Q&As I was using as a source for this one was filmed on March 1st. At that point, the developers of this game were asked about Epic Store exclusivity. It was in part of a larger question, but this was their response.
Epic Store, same case of not sure?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, look, you're game designers here. Okay, let's get back to the important questions.
Based on this, it seemed like at that point, these guys, being from Obsidian, genuinely had no idea it wasn't happening. I'm not a mind reader, but that certainly looked honest to me. We find out just 2.5 weeks later that it is an exclusive, so I don't really think they were involved in that decision-making process. And even further, as to the question, will they be at E3?
Is the Outer Worlds going to be at E3 this year?
We'll see. Is what our PR guy is telling us.
All right, good job, PR guy.
The reaction to that one just seems like a yes. Obviously, they're going to be at E3, hopefully with a release date announcement. The game's coming out in 2019. It seems like E3 is where they'll reveal when exactly in 2019. But either way, that kind of wraps it up for all of this information we do have. I try to combine several different sources and take relevant info and combine it together in this video. Hopefully you found it informative. Hopefully you found it interesting. I'm really excited for this game, and I'm really excited to see what they have to offer this year's E3, which is just a few months away now. But with that, I thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you all next time. Later.
Tim, do you have a date in your mind right now that you know the game's going to be released on?
No.
Okay, that feels like a yes. All right.